The Oregon Trail killed roughly 1 in 10 people who attempted it, and almost none of them died the way you've been told. You probably have a version of the story already. Wagons circled against attack, dramatic river crossings, maybe a cholera death that hits like a plot point. That version isn't wrong because it's dramatic. It's wrong because the real story is stranger, darker, and more human than anything a textbook had room for. The details that got left out aren't minor footnotes. Some of them completely changed what the journey actually was. Who survived it, why, and what cost it took to get there. This video is about what life on the Oregon Trail actually looked like. The version most people carry around in their heads comes from textbooks, video games, and movies, and almost all of it is a simplified version of something far stranger and more interesting. I've been digging into the primary sources and historical records on this one, and there are details here that genuinely change how the whole thing feels. We're going to cover the myths, the numbers that don't make sense until you sit with them, and one detail near the end that reframes almost everything we think we know about how this story gets told at all. Let's start with something that gives you a physical reality of this journey before anything else. More than 300,000 people made the journey from the Missouri River to the Pacific Northwest, California, and Utah between 1840 and 1869. That number alone is staggering, but what makes it stranger is the pace. Wagon trains moved at around 15 to 20 miles a day when conditions were good. Some historians put it even lower, closer to 10 to 15 miles on a typical day, at 1 to 2 miles per hour. That's barely faster than a relaxed walk. Think about that. 2,000 miles and 5 to 6 months, at a pace where you could keep up on foot without breaking a sweat. And most of them did exactly that. Because here's the first thing the popular image gets completely wrong. The wagons had small beds and almost no suspension, which made for a notoriously bumpy ride. So settlers typically preferred to ride horses or walk alongside their wagons on foot. The wagon wasn't a vehicle for people. Many migrants walked beside the wagons rather than riding in them. The interior was crammed with food and tools, not passengers. Some accounts describe people walking barefoot by the end, their shoes worn through by hundreds of miles of trail. The wagon was essentially a moving storage unit that the family walked next to for half a year. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because the wagon itself wasn't what you think it was either. Most immigrants used a light prairie wagon or prairie schooner, not the heavy Conestoga of popular imagery. That big, curved, boat-shaped wagon you've seen in every Western film and on the Oregon Trail game loading screen. While the Conestoga was an indispensable part of trade and travel in the East, it was far too large and unwieldy to survive the rugged terrain of the frontier. The actual wagons were smaller, lighter farm wagons retrofitted with canvas cover. They were roughly 10 to 12 feet long, weighing between 1,000 and 1,400 pounds empty. The whole point was to keep the weight down because the animals pulling them had to stay alive for 2,000 miles. Which brings us to the animals. And another thing almost nobody gets right. Wagons are pulled by oxen, not horses, because native raiding parties would only take horses in raids. Most parties used 4 to 6 oxen rather than horses. Oxen were cheaper, hardier, and better able to subsist on the trail forage. The tactical detail is something most people have never heard, and it quietly dismantles the whole wagon train under siege image. The people planning these journeys weren't naive. They made a deliberate calculation, use animals that raiders have no interest in, so the wagon train keeps moving even if something goes wrong. The oxen were slow, stubborn, and not particularly glamorous, but they were the reason most families actually made it. Now speaking of what actually threatened people out there. And this is where the story gets genuinely unsettling. It wasn't what the movies told you. Most Native Americans tolerated wagon trains passing through their territories, and many pioneers would not have made it without trading with the tribes along the trail. Deaths from native attacks, when compared to the total number of people traveling, were very rare. Between 1840 and 1860, it's estimated that Native Americans killed 362 immigrants, and immigrants killed 426 Native Americans over 20 years of mass migration. Native Americans were more likely to be allies and trading partners than adversaries, and many early wagon trades made use of Pawnee and Shoshone trail guides. The larger truth is that most contact between immigrants and Native Americans on the overland trails was peaceful. The circle wagons image is almost entirely mythology. What actually killed people was something invisible, and it moved faster than any raiding party could. Cholera resulted in more illness and death than all other maladies experienced by the emigrants combined. It comes from a waterborne bacteria that thrives in polluted, stagnant water, progresses rapidly, and attacks the intestinal lining. And the effects were so severe and rapid that victims often died within 12 hours of their first symptoms. 12 hours. People in good spirits in the morning could be in agony by noon and dead by evening. Symptoms started with a stomach ache that grew to intense pain within minutes. Then came diarrhea and vomiting that quickly dehydrated the victim, and within hours the skin was wrinkling and turning blue. Cholera spread by contaminated water was responsible for the most deaths overall on the Oregon Trail. It could attack a perfectly healthy person after breakfast, and he would be in his grave by noon. The trail corridor, known as the nation's longest graveyard, for good reason. There were anywhere between 10 and 15 deaths per mile of the trail. Estimates are as high as 5,000 deaths from cholera in 1849 alone. And yet, somehow, life kept going alongside all of it. Weddings happened on the trail. Babies were born in wagon camps. People fell in love somewhere between the Platte River and Fort Laramie and got married right there in the grass. The journey didn't pause life. It just ran life and death on the same track at the same time. If you're finding this stuff as wild as I did when I first got into it, drop a comment below with the detail that surprised you most. It genuinely helps the video reach more people, and I read through them. Also, if you want to go deeper on what it looks like to live through different events, I'd consider checking out some of my other videos. Now, back to the trail, because we haven't gotten to the most disorienting part yet. Do you remember those 300,000 people? Remember the 5 to 6 months of walking, the cholera, the oxen, the lightweight wagons, the trade with the native guides? All of that happened, and most of it left almost no written record from the people who actually lived it. Here's why that matters more than it might seem. It's estimated that only about 1 in every 250 immigrants kept a diary or journal during the journey. 1 in 250. That means almost every quote you ever read about the Oregon Trail, every first-person account, every pioneer voice in a documentary or textbook, all of it comes from a tiny, unrepresentative slice of people who actually made the trip. The people most likely to keep detailed journeys were also the most likely to be literate, educated, and relatively wealthy. The majority of immigrants, the ordinary farmers, the young families, the people who were barely scraping together enough to make the journey at all, left almost nothing behind in writing. Their experience of the trail is mostly silence. That changes everything about how we understand this story. The version that survived is the version that the most articulate minority wrote down. The rest of it, the real texture of what 300,000 people actually felt and saw and lost, is largely gone. And that silence connects back to something I mentioned at the start. The trail itself was never one clean line across the continent. Many sections of the trail became junk heaps filled with the discarded food barrels and wagon parts, broken down prairie schooners, and dead draft animals. And it wasn't unusual to see personal items like books, clothes, and even furniture. The trail braided across the landscape, sometimes spreading miles wide depending on terrain, water, and where the grass was. Families made their own choices, found their own paths, and then converged again at river crossings and mountain passes. There was no single road. There was just the general direction of west, and however you could manage to get there. Fort Laramie in Wyoming eventually became known as Camp Sacrifice for its reputation as an Oregon Trail dumping ground. During the 1849 gold rush, pioneers reportedly abandoned a whopping 20,000 pounds of bacon outside its walls. Accounts tell of dumping grounds outside the fort filled with treasured possessions like bookcases, furniture, iron safes, and books. Practical things were left too, by people needing to spare their oxen of dragging the heavy loads. Anvils, weapons, plows, kegs, and barrels, all dumped. One traveler described seeing bacon in great piles, many cords of it, sitting in the Wyoming dust. In popular jumping-off points, like Independence, Missouri, unscrupulous merchants made a killing by conning frightened pioneer families into buying more provisions than they actually needed. So, families set out overloaded, and then the trail forced them to shed everything. The furniture, the extra food, the weight of whoever they used to be, just to keep moving. That image is the Oregon Trail. Not the heroic march west, not the dramatic showdown. It's the family standing next to a pile of everything they owned, somewhere in Wyoming, deciding what they can afford to leave behind, and then walking on. Nearly 1 in 10 of those who set off on the Oregon Trail did not survive. The ones who did arrived changed in ways they couldn't fully explain, and most of them never wrote a word about it. The story we have is the edge of the real story. A narrow slice of voices from a journey taken by hundreds of thousands of people across some of the hardest terrain on the continent, at a walking pace for half a year, with everything they had loaded into a lightweight farm wagon, being pulled by oxen nobody wanted to steal. That's the Oregon Trail, not the myth, the actual thing. If this kind of history is what you're looking for, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.